when the weathered old man sitting in seat 14 leaned forward and whispered, "I buried a secret for 63 years, and seeing you drive this bus just brought it all back. I nearly swerved off I-75 right there in the Georgia heat, because what he was about to tell me would unravel everything I thought I knew about my late wife's first marriage and prove that sometimes the most profound love stories are the ones that never get told. If you believe that love can transcend time, circumstances, and even death itself, you're going to want to hear every word of what happened during that sweltering afternoon drive from Atlanta to Valdosta, because this isn't just another story about strangers on public transportation. My name is Frank Rodriguez, and I've been driving buses for the Metropolitan Atlanta Transit Authority for 42 years. But today marks exactly 6 months since I started working the long-distance routes between major Georgia cities, a decision I made after my wife Carmen passed away last winter, and I realized I couldn't bear sitting alone in our empty house in Decatur, surrounded by 47 years of memories, and wondering how I was supposed to fill the remaining years of my life without the woman who had been my everything since we met at a church social in 1977. Carmen had been married once before, very briefly when she was 19, to a man named David who died in Vietnam before they'd been married even a full year, and in all our decades together, she rarely talked about that first marriage, except to say it was a different lifetime, a chapter closed so long ago that it felt more like a dream than something that had actually happened to her. The particular route I was driving that Tuesday afternoon in August was one I'd grown familiar with over the past several months, the straight shot down I-75 that connects Atlanta's urban sprawl with the smaller towns scattered across southern Georgia, carrying a mix of passengers that included college students heading home for visits, elderly folks traveling to see family, and working people who couldn't afford cars but needed to get from one city to another for jobs, medical appointments, or family obligations that couldn't be handled over the phone. It was the kind of route where you got to know some of the regular passengers, people who rode the same bus every few weeks and gradually shared pieces of their stories during the 4-hour journey that took you through changing landscapes of pine forests, small farming communities, and towns that seemed frozen in time from decades past. Walter Henley had been riding my bus sporadically for about 3 months, always buying a ticket to Tifton, where he said he visited his sister in a nursing home, always sitting in the same seat if it was available, always polite but quiet, the kind of passenger who nodded respectfully when he boarded, kept to himself during the journey, and thanked me genuinely when he disembarked. He appeared to be in his late 70s, with silver hair that was still thick despite his age, hands that showed the wear of decades of manual labor, and clothes that were clean and pressed but obviously not expensive, the wardrobe of a man who had learned to take care of himself and maintain his dignity, regardless of his financial circumstances. His eyes were what I noticed most about him, pale blue and sharp with intelligence, but carrying the kind of sadness that comes from losing people you love and realizing that most of your life is now in the past, rather than stretching out ahead of you full of possibilities and adventures yet to be experienced. On this particular afternoon, the bus was less crowded than usual, maybe 20 passengers scattered among the 56 seats, and the air conditioning was struggling against the August heat that had already reached 96 degrees by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Walter had boarded in Atlanta as always, nodded his greeting as always, and settled into seat 14 with a small paper bag that probably contained a sandwich and maybe a thermos of coffee, the kind of modest travel provisions that suggested he was careful with his money, but still maintained the habits of self-sufficiency that had probably served him well throughout his adult life. For the first hour of the journey, everything proceeded normally, with passengers reading books or newspapers, a few talking quietly on their phones, and most simply watching the Georgia countryside roll past the windows while lost in their own thoughts about whatever had prompted their decision to travel on this particular day. But as we crossed the county line into Butts County, Walter suddenly stood up from his seat and made his way to the front of the bus, moving carefully but steadily, despite what appeared to be some stiffness in his left knee, and positioned himself in the seat directly behind me, where passengers sometimes sat when they wanted to talk to the driver, without disturbing other riders. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror and saw an expression I'd never seen on his face before, a mixture of nervousness and determination that suggested he'd been wrestling with some decision and had finally made up his mind to act on whatever conclusion he'd reached during his internal debate. "Mr. Rodriguez, he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for me to hear but not disturbing the other passengers. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I've been riding your bus for a while now, and there's something about you that reminds me of someone I knew a very long time ago. It's been bothering me for weeks, trying to figure out what it was, and today I finally realized what it is. You have the same gentle way of treating people that she had, the same kindness in your eyes when you're helping someone who's struggling with their luggage or needs directions, the same patience with passengers who ask too many questions or take too long getting settled in their seats. I wasn't sure how to respond to such a personal observation from someone who was essentially a stranger, but something in his tone suggested this wasn't just casual conversation, that Walter had something specific on his mind that he needed to share. And my 42 years of driving buses had taught me that sometimes passengers needed to talk to someone who was essentially neutral, someone who would listen without judgment and then disappear from their lives at the end of the journey, making the bus driver a kind of confessor for people carrying burdens they couldn't share with family or friends who might be too close to the situation to provide the kind of understanding they were seeking. "I appreciate that, Mr. Henley," I said, keeping my voice equally quiet and my attention primarily on the road ahead, while still indicating that I was willing to listen to whatever he felt compelled to share. "It sounds like whoever you're thinking of was someone special to you." Walter was quiet for several minutes, and I could see him in the mirror struggling with something, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his shirt sleeve, his eyes focused on the passing landscape, but clearly seeing something other than pine trees and farmland. When he finally spoke again, his voice was even softer than before, barely above a whisper, and I had to strain to hear him over the sound of the bus engine and the air conditioning system that was working overtime against the oppressive Georgia heat. "Her name was Carmen Delgado," he said, and the sound of my late wife's maiden name coming from this stranger's lips hit me like a physical blow, causing me to grip the steering wheel tighter and fight the urge to pull over immediately and demand an explanation for how this elderly man knew details about my wife's life from decades before I'd even met her. We were married in 1963, just for 11 months before I shipped out to Vietnam, and I never saw her again after the day I left for basic training. She was 19 years old, the most beautiful girl in Valdosta, and I was 21, and so in love with her that I couldn't imagine any future that didn't include spending the rest of my life making her happy and building a family together in the little house we'd rented on Elm Street, 3 blocks from where her parents lived and 5 blocks from the auto repair shop where I'd been working since I graduated from high school. The coincidences were too specific to be anything other than the truth, and I realized that I was listening to Walter Henley, the first husband my wife had mentioned so rarely that I'd almost forgotten he'd ever existed, the young man who had supposedly died in combat in Southeast Asia more than 60 years ago, somehow sitting alive and well on my bus and telling me a story that was going to change everything. I thought I understood about Carmen's early life and the grief she'd carried silently throughout our entire marriage. The revelation that Walter Henley was somehow connected to my late wife Carmen struck me with such force that I had to focus intensely on keeping the bus steady on the highway, while my mind raced through decades of memories, trying to reconcile this living, breathing man with the tragic figure Carmen had described as her first husband, who had died so young in a war that had claimed so many lives from their generation. Walter seemed to sense my shock and confusion because he continued talking in that same quiet, careful tone that suggested he understood the enormity of what he was revealing and wanted to make sure I heard every detail of a story that had apparently been weighing on his conscience for more than 6 decades. "I know what you're thinking, Mr. Rodriguez, and I know this must be impossible to believe, but I need you to understand that Carmen thought I was dead because that's what the army told her, that's what they told my parents, that's what everyone in Valdosta believed for all these years," Walter said, his voice gaining strength as he continued speaking, as if finally sharing this secret was providing him with a sense of relief he hadn't experienced in decades. "There was an explosion at our forward operating base near Da Nang in February of 1964, and several soldiers were killed, including 2 men from my unit, and in the confusion and chaos that followed, my dog tags got mixed up with those of another soldier who had been killed instantly, a young man named David Walter Henley, who was from a small town in North Carolina and had no immediate family to notify." Walter paused in his story, and I could see him in the rearview mirror wiping his eyes with a handkerchief that looked like it had been carefully folded and carried in his pocket for years, the kind of old-fashioned accessory that men of his generation still used and maintained as a matter of personal dignity and preparedness for moments when emotions might overwhelm their composure. The other passengers on the bus seemed unaware of the extraordinary conversation taking place in the front seats, most of them dozing in the afternoon heat or absorbed in their own activities, creating a kind of private space where Walter could continue revealing details of a story that was reshaping my understanding of my wife's past and my own role in her life. I was badly injured in that explosion, Mr. Rodriguez. Badly enough that I was unconscious for 6 weeks and couldn't speak coherently for months after that, and by the time I recovered enough to try to contact the army and explain what had happened, Carmen had already been officially notified that her husband, Private Walter David Henley, had been killed in action and was being posthumously awarded a Bronze Star for his service to his country, Walter continued, his voice breaking slightly as he described what must have been one of the most agonizing periods of his life. I tried everything I could think of to reach her, to let her know that I was alive and wanted nothing more than to come home and rebuild the life we'd planned together, but the military bureaucracy was impossible to navigate, especially for a young soldier who had suffered traumatic brain injuries and was still struggling with basic cognitive functions. And every letter I sent was returned unopened. Every phone call was blocked. Every attempt to contact her family was met with hostility and accusations that I was some kind of cruel imposter trying to cause additional pain to a young woman who was already devastated by grief. The weight of what Walter was telling me was almost unbearable, and I found myself thinking about all the times over the years when Carmen had looked sad for no apparent reason, all the moments when she'd seemed to be remembering something painful that she couldn't or wouldn't share with me, all the occasions when she'd mentioned her first husband with such careful brevity that I'd learned not to ask follow-up questions because I could see that talking about that period of her life caused her distress that I didn't want to amplify by pushing for details she wasn't ready to provide. Now I was learning that her grief hadn't been just for a young love cut tragically short by war, but for a husband who had actually survived and spent decades trying to find his way back to the woman he'd never stopped loving, never stopped hoping to reunite with, despite the impossible obstacles that had been placed in his path. By the time I was finally able to convince a social worker at the Veterans Administration to help me investigate what had happened, more than 2 years had passed, and Carmen had moved away from Valdosta, gotten a job in Atlanta, and was trying to build a new life for herself based on the belief that I was gone forever, Walter said, and I could hear the pain and regret in his voice as he described the cruel irony of timing that had kept them apart. I hired a private detective with money I'd saved from my military pay, and he was able to track her down, but when he made contact with her to ask if she'd be willing to speak with someone who claimed to be her first husband, she became so upset that she threatened to call the police if anyone ever contacted her again, with what she considered a sick joke about the most painful period of her life. I had to pull over at that point, not because of any mechanical problem with the bus, but because the emotional impact of Walter's story was making it impossible for me to concentrate on driving safely while processing the implications of everything he was telling me. I activated the hazard lights and pulled into a rest area near Macon, explaining to the passengers that we were taking a brief unscheduled break for a mechanical check, and gestured for Walter to follow me off the bus so we could continue this conversation in private without the risk of other passengers overhearing details of a story that was already almost too personal and painful to discuss in public. Standing in the shade beside the bus while the Georgia heat shimmered off the asphalt parking lot, Walter looked even older and more fragile than he had appeared while sitting in seat 14, and I realized that sharing this story was taking a tremendous emotional toll on him, requiring him to relive decades of frustration, disappointment, and loss that he had probably tried very hard to put behind him in order to function in whatever life he had eventually built for himself after accepting that he would never be reunited with his first wife. "Walter, I need to tell you something that's going to be difficult for both of us to hear," I said gently, because I realized that I owed him the truth about Carmen's death, just as he had chosen to share the truth about his survival with me. Carmen passed away 6 months ago last February, after we'd been married for 47 years. She died in her sleep from a heart attack, peacefully and without pain, surrounded by our children and grandchildren who loved her dearly, but she never knew that you had survived Vietnam. never knew that you had tried to find her, never knew that the great love of her youth had actually lived a full life, and spent decades wondering what might have been if circumstances had been different. The look of devastation that crossed Walter's face when he heard that Carmen was gone was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. The collapse of hope that had apparently sustained him through 63 years of wondering and searching, and never quite giving up the possibility that somehow, someday, he might have the chance to see her again and explain what had really happened to separate them so completely and permanently. He sat down heavily on a concrete barrier near the bus, his hands shaking, as he processed the reality that the woman he had never stopped loving was gone forever, taking with her any possibility of reconciliation, explanation, or closure to the story that had defined so much of his adult life. But before we go any further with Walter's story, and what it revealed about love, loss, and the connections that bind us together across decades and circumstances we can't control, I want to pause for a moment and talk directly to you, because if you're still listening to this story, it tells me something important about who you are as a person. You understand that the most meaningful human experiences often come from unexpected encounters with strangers who carry stories we never could have imagined, that love doesn't always follow the patterns we expect it to follow, and that sometimes the most profound truths about our own lives are revealed through learning about the experiences of people we might never have thought to ask about their deepest secrets and regrets. This isn't just another story for you to consume and forget, is it? This is a reminder that all of us are connected by experiences of love and loss that transcend the surface differences that might make us think we have nothing in common with strangers we encounter in our daily lives, and that every person we meet is carrying stories that could change our understanding of our own families, our own relationships, our own assumptions about how life works, and what really matters when everything else falls away. If Walter's courage in finally sharing his secret has touched something in your heart, if his decades of quiet devotion to a woman who never knew he was still alive has reminded you of love stories in your own family that maybe never got told completely, I'd love for you to become part of our community here, where we share these stories not just as entertainment, but as bridges that connect us to each other and remind us that none of us are really alone in this world, no matter how isolated our pain might sometimes feel. After Walter had composed himself enough to continue talking, we walked slowly back toward the bus where other passengers were beginning to show signs of restlessness at our extended stop. But I knew that whatever he was going to tell me next would be crucial for understanding not just his story, but something deeper about the nature of love and loyalty that transcends death itself. As we settled back into our seats and I pulled the bus back onto I-75, Walter seemed to have found a new resolve, as if learning about Carmen's death had somehow freed him to share details he might have held back if there had still been a possibility of protecting her from painful truths about their shared past. "Frank, there's something else I need to tell you about those years after I tried to contact Carmen, and she refused to see me. Something that might help you understand why I've been riding your bus and why seeing you reminded me so strongly of her," Walter said, his voice steadier now despite the obvious emotional toll that discussing Carmen's death had taken on him. After the private detective told me that Carmen had become upset and didn't want any further contact from anyone claiming to be her first husband, I made a decision that probably wasn't entirely rational, but it felt like the only way I could still be part of her life in some small way, even if she never knew it. Walter explained that he had moved to Atlanta in 1967, found work as a mechanic at a garage in Decatur, and spent the next several years quietly keeping track of Carmen's life from a distance, never approaching her or trying to make contact, but simply wanting to know that she was safe and happy and building the kind of future she deserved after enduring so much grief at such a young age. He learned that she was working as a secretary at a downtown insurance company, living in a small apartment near Piedmont Park, and slowly beginning to date again after several years of mourning the husband she believed had been killed in Vietnam. "I watched her meet you at that church social in 1977, Walter said, and the revelation that he had somehow witnessed the beginning of my relationship with Carmen sent chills down my spine as I tried to imagine this man sitting somewhere in the background, observing the moment when I first asked his wife to dance and felt the immediate connection that would eventually lead to nearly 5 decades of marriage. I was doing volunteer maintenance work at the church, fixing things that needed repair, and I was there that evening when you approached her at the refreshment table and started that conversation about the music they were playing, how it reminded you of songs your mother used to sing while she was cooking dinner for your family. Walter's ability to recall such specific details from an event that had occurred 47 years earlier suggested that he had been paying very close attention that evening, memorizing moments that most casual observers would have forgotten within days or weeks, but which had taken on enormous significance for a man who was watching the woman he still loved begin a new relationship with someone else. I found myself trying to remember that night, trying to recall if I had noticed anyone in the background who might have been watching Carmen with particular interest, but the truth was that I had been so focused on her, so captivated by her smile and her intelligence, and her gentle way of making everyone around her feel comfortable and valued, that I probably wouldn't have noticed if the entire congregation had been staring at us. I could see how happy you made her, Frank, could see it in her face when she looked at you, could hear it in her laugh when you told those terrible jokes that weren't actually funny, but made her smile anyway because she could see what a good heart you had, Walter continued. And despite the strangeness of the situation, I found myself feeling touched by his observation that Carmen had been genuinely happy in our relationship, that whatever sadness she carried from her first marriage hadn't prevented her from opening her heart to love again. I made another decision that night, watching the two of you together, seeing how naturally you fit with each other, how comfortable she seemed in your presence. I decided that my job wasn't to try to win her back or to disrupt the new life she was building, but to make sure that nothing bad ever happened to her again if it was within my power to prevent it. What Walter told me next was perhaps the most extraordinary part of his story, because it revealed that for the past 47 years he had essentially appointed himself as Carmen's unofficial guardian, staying close enough to Atlanta to keep track of our family's well-being, taking jobs that allowed him flexibility to help us during difficult times, and intervening in ways so subtle that we never realized we were receiving assistance from someone who had every reason to resent our happiness, but had chosen instead to protect it. When our first child was born in 1979, and we were struggling financially because I had to take unpaid leave from work due to complications from the delivery, an anonymous donor paid our hospital bills and left an envelope of cash in our mailbox with a note saying it was from someone who wanted to help young families get started in life. When our house was damaged by a tornado in 1983 and our insurance company was slow to process our claim, a crew of volunteer workers showed up and completed the repairs for free, saying they were from a church outreach program that helped families affected by natural disasters. Every time your family faced a crisis, every time Carmen needed help that you couldn't provide or support that wasn't available through official channels, I found ways to make sure she got what she needed, Walter said, his voice filled with quiet pride as he described decades of secret acts of service that had apparently made our lives easier and safer without our ever knowing where the help was coming from. When your youngest son was in that car accident in 1995 and needed surgery that your insurance wouldn't fully cover, I liquidated my retirement account and made sure the medical bills got paid anonymously. When Carmen's mother was dying in 2001 and needed expensive medications that Medicare wouldn't approve, I found a way to get those prescriptions filled and delivered to her nursing home as if they were covered by a special assistance program for elderly patients. The scope of Walter's hidden involvement in our family's life was overwhelming to contemplate, and I realized that countless moments of good fortune, unexpected assistance, and miraculous solutions to seemingly impossible problems had actually been the result of this man's quiet devotion to ensuring Carmen's happiness and security throughout her adult life. Every time I had thanked God for providing help during difficult times, every time Carmen and I had marveled at how fortunate we were to live in a community where neighbors helped neighbors and strangers sometimes became angels who appeared exactly when they were needed most, we had actually been benefiting from the love and sacrifice of a man whose existence we didn't even suspect. But Walter, why are you telling me this now? I asked, because while I was profoundly moved by his story and grateful beyond words for everything he had done for our family, I couldn't understand what had prompted him to reveal these secrets after maintaining them so carefully for so many decades. Carmen is gone, our children are grown and successful, and you've already given us more than we ever could have asked for or expected from anyone. What made you decide that today was the day to share all of this with me? Walter was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the pine forests and small towns that lined I-75 as we continued our journey toward Valdosta, and I could see him in the rearview mirror struggling to find words for whatever he was feeling, whatever decision he had reached that had made him choose this particular bus ride as the moment to unburden himself of secrets he had carried alone for most of his adult life. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft that I had to strain to hear him over the sound of the air conditioning and the rumble of the bus engine working against the Georgia heat. "Because I'm dying, Frank," he said simply, without drama or self-pity, just stating a fact that he had apparently accepted with the same quiet dignity that had characterized all his other major life decisions. "Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 3 months ago, and the doctors say I have maybe 6 weeks left, probably less. I've been riding your bus to Tifton to get treatments at the hospital there because I didn't want to burden my sister with the knowledge that I was sick, didn't want her to worry about me during what might be the last months of her own life, since she's 91 and not in great health herself." The news that Walter was terminally ill added yet another layer of poignancy to an already extraordinary story, and I found myself feeling a deep sadness, not just for his impending death, but for the realization that Carmen would never know how much she had been loved by the husband she thought she had lost in Vietnam, never know that her first marriage had been sustained in secret by a devotion that had lasted longer than most marriages that are celebrated with golden anniversary parties and surrounded by children and grandchildren who take such enduring love for granted. As we passed through the small Georgia towns that marked our progress toward Valdosta, Walter continued sharing details of his secret life as Carmen's unseen protector, and each revelation made me understand more clearly how different our family's story would have been without his quiet intervention during moments when we needed help but had nowhere to turn for assistance. He told me about the scholarship fund he had established at our children's high school, funded entirely from his own modest savings, but administered through a fictional foundation that had provided college tuition assistance to both our sons when they were accepted to universities that we couldn't afford on my bus driver's salary alone. He described how he had monitored our neighborhood for years, making sure our house was secure when we were away on family vacations, reporting suspicious activity to police, and even confronting a potential burglar one night in 1988 when he noticed someone trying to break into our garage while Carmen and I were visiting her sister in Florida. "I know this probably sounds obsessive or unhealthy, Frank, and I've questioned my own motives countless times over the years, wondering if I was being a protector or a stalker, whether my actions were motivated by genuine love for Carmen or by some kind of possessive need to remain connected to a life that I should have accepted was no longer mine to influence," Walter said. His honesty about his own psychological state, making it clear that he had spent decades examining his behavior and its implications, trying to understand the difference between devotion and obsession, between love and control. "But I want you to know that I never interfered with your marriage, never tried to undermine your relationship with Carmen, never attempted to make contact with her or let her know that I was still alive, because I could see that she was genuinely happy with you in ways that she might never have been happy with me if I had come back from Vietnam as the damaged, traumatized man I became after my injuries." Walter's self-awareness about the psychological complexity of his situation was both touching and troubling, and I found myself trying to imagine what it would have been like to love someone so deeply that you could spend 47 years sacrificing your own happiness to ensure theirs, never asking for recognition or gratitude, never expecting anything in return, except the knowledge that the person you loved was safe and content and surrounded by people who appreciated her wonderful qualities. It was a level of selfless devotion that I wasn't sure I could have maintained under similar circumstances, and it made me wonder what kind of man Walter might have been if his life hadn't been derailed by a case of mistaken identity in a Vietnamese jungle and a bureaucratic error that had separated him permanently from the woman he'd married with such hope and optimism. "There is one more thing I need to tell you, Frank, something that might be difficult for you to hear, but that I think you have a right to know, especially since you loved Carmen for so much longer than I was able to," Walter said, his voice taking on a tone of careful preparation that suggested he was about to share information that could potentially change my understanding of my wife in fundamental ways. Carmen knew, not consciously, not in a way that she could have articulated or acted upon, but on some level she knew that someone was watching over your family, someone who cared about her welfare in ways that went beyond normal neighborly concern or community support. Walter explained that he had occasionally seen Carmen looking around during public events, scanning crowds, as if she was searching for a familiar face, and that she had mentioned to mutual acquaintances that she sometimes felt like someone was watching her, not in a threatening way, but with the kind of protective attention that made her feel safe, even when she couldn't explain why. He had overheard her talking to our neighbor, Mrs. Williams, in 2003, about how fortunate our family had been over the years, how many times help had appeared exactly when we needed it most, and how she sometimes wondered if her first husband was somehow still looking out for her from wherever he was, whether that was heaven or some other realm where love continues to exist even after death separates people who were meant to spend their lives together. She told Mrs. Williams that she believed in guardian angels, not the religious kind necessarily, but the idea that people who love us deeply might find ways to continue caring for us even after circumstances make it impossible for them to be physically present in our lives, Walter said. And I remembered that conversation because Carmen had shared similar thoughts with me on several occasions, usually late at night, when we were lying in bed talking about the day's events and reflecting on how blessed we felt to have each other and our children, and a life that, while not without its challenges, had been filled with more joy and security than either of us had dared to expect when we were young and struggling to establish our place in the world. The revelation that Carmen had somehow intuited Walter's presence in our lives, even without understanding the specific details or the true identity of her mysterious benefactor, added yet another dimension to an already complex story, and I found myself wondering how many other aspects of our marriage and family life had been influenced by undercurrents I had never detected or fully understood. It made me think about all the times Carmen had insisted on taking different routes home from work, or had suddenly decided to change our vacation plans for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, or had seemed to know things about our children's needs and challenges that I hadn't noticed until she pointed them out to me, with the kind of maternal intuition that I had attributed to her natural sensitivity and emotional intelligence. Frank, there's something I want to give you before we reach Valdosta, something that belongs to you now more than it belongs to me, Walter said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small wooden box that looked like it had been carefully maintained for decades, its surface polished smooth by years of handling and its hinges still functioning perfectly despite its obvious age. This was Carmen's wedding ring from our marriage, the ring I put on her finger in July of 1963 when we promised each other that nothing would ever separate us, that we would love each other forever, regardless of what challenges life might bring us. I've carried it with me every day for 63 years, not as a symbol of what I lost, but as a reminder of what I was privileged to experience, even if it was for such a brief time. When Walter placed that small wooden box in my hands, I could feel the weight of decades of love, loss, hope, and resignation that it represented, and I understood that I was being entrusted with something far more significant than a piece of jewelry. This ring represented the beginning of Carmen's adult life, her first experience of romantic love, her initial understanding of what it meant to commit yourself completely to another person and believe that such commitment would be honored and reciprocated for the rest of your shared lives. It was a symbol of innocence and optimism that had been preserved through war, separation, grief, and the slow passage of time that eventually heals most wounds, even as it creates new ones to take their place. Inside the box, nestled in faded blue velvet that had probably been bright and new when Carmen was 19 years old and excited about starting her life as a married woman, was a simple gold band that was clearly different from the wedding ring I had given her in 1977, more delicate and old-fashioned, engraved with tiny flowers that had been worn smooth by years of wear before it was removed and stored away as a memento of a marriage that had ended before it really had a chance to begin. There was also a small piece of paper, folded many times and obviously handled frequently, that contained what appeared to be a letter written in Carmen's youthful handwriting. She wrote that letter to me the day before I left for basic training, telling me how much she loved me and how she couldn't wait for me to come home so we could start our real life together, the life we had planned with children and a house full of laughter and all the ordinary miracles that make a marriage worth the effort it takes to maintain it through good times and difficult ones, Walter said, his voice breaking as he described the contents of a letter he had obviously read thousands of times over the years. I want you to have it, Because you were able to give her the life she described in that letter, the happiness she dreamed about when she was young, and believed that love could overcome any obstacle if two people were committed enough to fight for it together. As we approached the outskirts of Valdosta, where Walter would be getting off the bus to continue his journey to whatever final destination awaited a dying man who had spent 6 decades loving a woman from a distance, I found myself struggling with emotions I couldn't have anticipated when I started my shift that morning as just another routine run between Atlanta and the smaller cities of southern Georgia. The wooden box containing Carmen's first wedding ring sat heavy in my lap, and I kept opening it to look at the simple gold band that represented a chapter of my wife's life I had never fully understood, a period of hope and joy that had been cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control, but had somehow continued to influence our family's story in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. Walter seemed to sense that our conversation was drawing to a close, and he had grown quieter as the familiar landmarks of his childhood hometown began appearing outside the bus windows, as if returning to the place where his love story with Carmen had begun was forcing him to confront the full weight of everything he had given up and everything he had gained through his decision to remain her silent guardian rather than fighting harder to reclaim his place in her life when there might still have been opportunities to do so. Frank, I need to ask you for one final favor, something that's probably too much to ask of someone who's already heard more about this situation than any reasonable person should have to process, Walter said as I pulled the bus into the Valdosta station, where several passengers were preparing to disembark and others were waiting to board for the continuation of their journeys to destinations further south. When you get home tonight, would you be willing to tell your children about this conversation, about who I was and what their mother meant to me, not because I want to complicate their understanding of their parents' marriage, but because I think they deserve to know that there was someone else in the world who loved her as much as you did, who considered her well-being to be the most important responsibility of his entire adult life. The request was both touching and complicated, and I found myself wondering how our grown children would react to learning that their mother's first husband had survived Vietnam and spent decades secretly ensuring their family's security and happiness without ever revealing his identity or asking for acknowledgement of his sacrifices. Would they feel grateful for his protection, or would they feel disturbed by the idea that their childhood had been observed and influenced by a stranger whose motives, however well-intentioned, might seem unsettling when examined from the perspective of people who valued privacy and autonomy above all else? Would they appreciate the romantic nobility of Walter's devotion to Carmen, or would they question the psychological health of a man who had never allowed himself to move on from a marriage that had ended when he was barely 21 years old? I promise I'll tell them, Walter, and I'll make sure they understand that everything you did came from love, not from any desire to control or manipulate our family's life, but from the kind of deep commitment that most people only dream about experiencing, I said. Because regardless of how my children might react to the story, I knew that Walter deserved to have his decades of silent service acknowledged and remembered by the people who had benefited from his generosity and protection. And I want you to know that Carmen would have been touched to learn about your survival, proud of the man you became despite the tragedies that changed the direction of your life, grateful for every act of kindness you showed to our family over the years. Walter nodded and stood slowly, gathering his small paper bag and the lightweight jacket he had brought in case the air conditioning on the bus became too cold during the journey, and I could see that he was preparing to say goodbye, not just to me, but to the last direct connection he would ever have to the woman who had been the love of his life and the organizing principle around which all his major decisions had revolved for more than 6 decades. As he moved toward the front of the bus where I was sitting, he paused and placed his hand on my shoulder with the kind of gentle touch that conveyed respect, gratitude, and the shared understanding that comes from loving the same person deeply, even under completely different circumstances. Take care of that ring, Frank, and when the time comes, maybe give it to one of your daughters-in-law or granddaughters as something old for their wedding day, something that represents the power of love to endure even when everything else falls apart, Walter said, his voice steady despite the tears that were clearly threatening to overwhelm his composure as he prepared to walk away from our bus and out of my life forever. And remember that Carmen was lucky to have 2 men who loved her enough to put her happiness ahead of their own, even when doing so required sacrifices that most people would never be willing to make. As Walter stepped off the bus and walked slowly across the parking lot toward a taxi that would take him to whatever appointment awaited him in Valdosta, I sat for several minutes watching him disappear into the afternoon heat, carrying with him secrets and memories that would die with him in a few weeks, taking to his grave the full story of a love that had been sustained by hope, sacrifice, and the kind of devotion that transforms ordinary people into guardian angels for those they can never stop caring about. The other passengers who had boarded in Valdosta were settling into their seats for the final leg of our journey, but I found myself reluctant to start the bus and continue driving, reluctant to return to the routine responsibilities of my job when I had just experienced something that had fundamentally changed my understanding of my own life and the forces that had shaped my family's story in ways I had never imagined. That evening, when I returned to my empty house in Decatur and sat at the kitchen table, where Carmen and I had shared thousands of meals over the years, I called each of our 3 children and told them about my encounter with Walter Henley, about their mother's first marriage, and its unexpected continuation through decades of secret guardianship that had touched their lives in countless ways they had never suspected. The conversations were emotional, complicated, and ultimately healing, as our children processed the news that their mother had been loved by 2 different men with the same intensity and commitment, that their own success and security had been partly the result of intervention by a stranger who had chosen to make their welfare his life's mission. 6 weeks later, I received a phone call from a funeral director in Valdosta informing me that Walter Henley had died peacefully in a hospice facility and had left instructions that I should be notified of his passing, along with a request that I consider attending his funeral service if doing so wouldn't be too difficult or inappropriate, given the unusual circumstances of our relationship. I drove down to Valdosta that weekend and found myself in a small church filled with people who had known Walter as a quiet, helpful member of their community, a man who had volunteered at the food bank, tutored children who were struggling in school, and maintained the church building with the same careful attention to detail that he had brought to watching over Carmen's family for nearly 5 decades. After the service, I stood beside Walter's grave and thanked him for everything he had given us, everything he had sacrificed to ensure that the woman he loved could build a happy life with someone else, everything he had taught me about the difference between possessive love and generous love, between holding on and letting go, between demanding recognition and serving in silence. I promised him that Carmen's first wedding ring would be treasured by our family as a symbol of enduring devotion, and that his story would be shared with our grandchildren as an example of how love can transcend death, time, and circumstances that seem designed to separate people who are meant to care for each other. And now, as I come to the end of this story about love that refuses to die, about guardian angels who don't wear wings, about the mysterious ways that strangers can become family, and family can include people we never even know exist, I want to share something with all of you who have listened to this extraordinary tale of devotion and sacrifice. If Walter's story has moved you, if it's reminded you of quiet heroes in your own life who might have protected and supported you in ways you never fully recognized, if it's made you think about the different ways that love can express itself, even when circumstances make traditional relationships impossible, then you understand something important about what it means to be human in a world that often seems designed to separate us from each other. This is more than just entertainment, isn't it? This is a reminder that love stories come in forms we might never expect, that the most profound acts of devotion often happen in secret, that guardian angels sometimes look like ordinary people riding buses and sitting in pews and working at jobs that keep them close enough to help when help is needed most. If you've ever been the Walter in someone's life, providing support and protection without expecting recognition or reward, or if you've ever been blessed by kindness from sources you never identified, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell us about the quiet heroes in your family's story, the unexpected interventions that changed everything, the love that endured despite impossible circumstances. Share your stories of chosen family, second chances, and guardian angels who appeared when you needed them most, because these stories remind us that we're all connected by experiences of love and loss that make us more alike than different, regardless of our backgrounds, ages, or circumstances. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Your experience might provide hope to someone who's struggling with loss or longing, or the feeling that they're facing their challenges completely alone. Join our community of people who believe in the power of love to transcend time, death, and the obstacles that seem designed to keep us apart, because together we can create a space where these remarkable human experiences are honored, shared, and remembered as proof that love really is the strongest force in the universe, even when it operates in ways we never expect or fully understand.